They had already marked the stall for euthanasia when the lame horse shifted his weight, not toward the gate, but toward a distant plow team cutting lines through the Wyoming dust. A broke farmer paused, watching that quiet insistence, and made a choice that would test everything he thought he knew about strength. Dust drifted across the yard in thin, restless sheets, carried by a wind that never seemed to stop moving in this part of Wyoming. The wooden rails creaked as horses shifted inside their narrow pens, some stamping, some pacing, some standing still, as if they had already learned there was nowhere left to go. Elias stood apart from the others. He didn't press against the fence like the younger ones. He didn't call out. His body carried a quiet imbalance, one hind leg resting just slightly off the ground, not enough to draw immediate pity, but enough that anyone experienced would notice. It wasn't a fresh injury. It was something older, something that had settled into him. A man in a worn denim jacket walked past his pen without slowing. He held a clipboard, pages clipped together with a rusted hinge, and stopped only long enough to glance down at the tag wired to the wood. "Unsound," he muttered, marking the paper with a short, final stroke. Further down, a steel gate clanged shut. The sound echoed longer than it should have, hanging in the air like something unresolved. A truck idled near the far end of the yard, exhaust trailing low to the ground. Elias shifted his weight again, not forward, not back, sideways. His head lifted, not toward the open lane or the movement of people, but toward the edge of the property, where a distant field stretched out beyond the fencing. There, faint against the pale horizon, a team of horses moved in slow, steady lines, pulling a plow through dry earth. The rhythm was measured, deliberate. Soil turned over in long, even ribbons. Elias watched them without blinking. A few pens over, a younger horse kicked at the boards, sharp and impatient. Another circled endlessly, wearing a path into the dirt. But Elias remained still, his ears tilted forward, tracking something only he seemed to care about. Boots crunched over gravel behind him. Cal Turner stopped at the edge of the pen, his shadow falling across the rails, before he stepped into view. He didn't reach out, didn't call softly like some did. He simply stood there, hands resting at his sides, eyes narrowing slightly as he took in the horse. There was nothing remarkable at first glance. Too thin, too quiet, one bad leg, the kind of animal people passed over without a second thought, not out of cruelty, but out of calculation. A horse like that didn't fit into anyone's plans. Cal had learned to think that way too, or at least he had tried. He shifted his stance, following the direction of the horse's gaze. It took him a moment to see it, the distant movement in the field, the slow pull of the plow team cutting through the land, like a memory of something older than all of this. Then he looked back at Elias. The horse hadn't moved, not even when a gate slammed somewhere nearby, not even when a man shouted orders across the yard. His attention held steady, fixed on that far-off work, as if it still meant something. Cal exhaled slowly, rubbing a thumb along the edge of his palm, a habit he had when numbers didn't add up. "This one's marked," the clipboard man called from behind him. "Not worth hauling anywhere." Cal didn't answer right away. He stepped closer instead, just enough that the horse's scent, dust, hay, something faintly metallic, rose into the air between them. Elias flicked an ear but didn't turn. His eyes stayed forward. "Doesn't look like he's quitting," Cal said finally, his voice low. The man behind him gave a short laugh. "Doesn't matter what he looks like." Maybe that was true. Out here, it usually was. Cal rested a hand on the top rail, fingers curling around the splintered wood. He watched the uneven stance again, the way the horse compensated without collapsing, the way he held himself, not resisting, not pleading, just waiting. For what? Cal couldn't say. But it wasn't empty. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a folded stack of bills that felt lighter than it should have. There were other things that money was meant for: feed, repairs, maybe one more season holding on to land that was already slipping through his fingers. He looked at the horse one last time, then toward the distant field, and back again. "I'll take him," Cal said. The words landed without weight, almost quiet enough to disappear in the wind, but they changed something all the same. A few minutes later the latch lifted. Elias hesitated at the threshold, his body leaning forward, then pausing as if measuring the ground beneath him. The yard behind him was still loud, still restless, but the space ahead felt different, wider, uncertain in another way. Cal didn't pull the lead. He gave the rope just enough slack and stepped forward first. After a moment, Elias followed. The limp was still there. It didn't vanish. Each step carried the same uneven rhythm, but now it moved in a direction that hadn't been offered to him before. Beyond the fence line, the wind carried the faint scent of dry grass and open land. Cal glanced back once, studying the way the horse walked, the way he adjusted, the way he refused to stop. It wasn't enough to convince anyone else, but it was enough to make a man wonder. And sometimes that was where everything began. Ahead of them, the long road back to the farm stretched out under a sky that showed no promise of rain. Cal tightened his grip slightly on the rope, not to control, but to steady. He didn't know yet what this choice would cost him. Only that whatever came next, it wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be quick. But for the first time in a long while, it felt like something worth trying. The road back to Cal Turner's farm stretched longer than it looked. Gravel crunched under his boots, steady and familiar, but behind him the rhythm came uneven, one step firm, one step guarded. Elias followed without resistance, though every few yards he shifted his weight as if testing the ground before trusting it. The rope between them stayed loose, swaying gently in the dry Wyoming wind. By the time the fence line of the farm came into view, the sun had already begun to lower, casting long shadows across a land that hadn't seen rain in weeks. The pasture was thinner than it should have been this time of year. Patches of earth showed through the grass like old scars. Cal paused at the gate, pushing it open with a slow creak. Elias stopped just behind him, ears flicking once, taking in the quiet. No shouting, no metal gates slamming, no restless horses pressing against each other. Just space. Inside the enclosure, an older mare lifted her head from a shallow pile of hay. Her coat had faded with age, a soft gray mottled with years of work, but her stance remained steady. She didn't move toward them. She simply watched. "Easy, May," Cal murmured, more out of habit than instruction. May took a few steps forward, slow and measured, her hooves landing with a confidence Elias did not yet have. She circled once, keeping distance, then stopped, facing him. There was no tension in her posture, no challenge. Elias shifted his weight again, that familiar hesitation in his hind leg. For a moment he stood still, as if unsure what was expected. Cal didn't step in, didn't shorten the rope. He let the silence do its work. After a long breath, Elias took a step forward, then another. The limp remained, unchanged, undeniable, but it didn't stop him. May lowered her head slightly, not in submission, but in acknowledgment, and turned back toward the hay. It was enough. That night, Cal left them under the open sky. No stalls, no tight spaces, just the fence line and the quiet stretch of land beyond it. From the porch he watched for a while, arms resting on the railing, the weight of the day settling into his shoulders. Elias didn't lie down. Even as the light faded, he stayed standing, shifting occasionally, adjusting, as if sleep required a kind of trust he hadn't yet found. Morning came with a pale, brittle light. Cal was already in the yard when Elias approached the water trough. The horse moved carefully, placing each hoof with intention, but he didn't hesitate the way he had the day before. May stood nearby, her presence steady, unbothered. Cal filled a small bucket with grain, not much, just enough to test appetite. Elias lowered his head slowly, nostrils flaring as he took in the scent. Then, cautiously, he ate. Not fast, not desperate, just enough. Cal watched without expression, though something in his posture eased. "Good," he muttered under his breath. The first attempt at work came later that morning. Not a saddle, not a rider, just a light harness and an empty dragboard, something used for smoothing out loose dirt near the fence line. Cal adjusted the straps carefully, leaving room where the horse needed it, checking the angle twice before stepping back. Elias stood still through it all, no pinned ears, no resistance. Only that quiet awareness. "Let's see what you can do," Cal said, more to himself than the horse. He clicked his tongue softly and stepped forward. Elias followed. The boards scraped lightly across the ground, leaving a faint trail behind them. The first few steps were uneven, the limp more pronounced under the added strain. Cal slowed his pace immediately, adjusting without thinking. They didn't go far, just a short line along the fence, then back, and stop. Cal unhooked the harness without a word, his movements efficient, practiced. He ran a hand along the horse's side, feeling the tension, the strain, noting where it held, where it released. "Not built for speed," he said quietly. "That's all right." Elias flicked an ear but didn't move away. The days settled into a pattern. Short tasks, long rests. Walking the perimeter, light pulling, nothing that forced the leg beyond what it could carry. Cal adjusted constantly, distance, weight, pace, watching not for perfection, but for consistency. May often moved alongside them, her presence a quiet anchor. When Elias hesitated, she didn't push. She simply continued, and somehow that was enough to draw him forward again. By the end of the first week, something had changed, not in the leg. The limp remained exactly as it had been. But the hesitation between steps had shortened. The pauses grew fewer. Elias began to move with a kind of rhythm, not smooth, not balanced, but steady. Cal noticed it one evening as they crossed the far end of the pasture, the sun low behind them, casting long shadows that stretched ahead across the dry earth. He stopped walking. Elias took one more step before halting, then shifted his weight, settling into place. Cal studied him in silence. "This isn't about fixing you," he said after a while. "Is it?" The wind moved through the grass, carrying the faint scent of dust and hay. Elias stood there, breathing slow and even, his gaze drifting once more, not to the fence this time, but across the open land beyond it, toward something that still waited. Cal followed that look, narrowing his eyes slightly, as if trying to see what the horse saw. There were things out there he couldn't afford to think about. Not yet. But the idea had already taken hold, and once it did, it didn't leave easily. He turned back toward the house, motioning lightly with his hand. "Come on," he said. Elias stepped forward without pause. Behind them, the marks left in the dirt were uneven, but they continued in a straight line. And for the first time, Cal began to wonder, not if the horse could work it, but what kind of work he had been waiting for all along. By mid-July, the land had hardened. The topsoil cracked in thin, jagged lines, and every step across the pasture released a faint, dry whisper. Cal had seen seasons like this before, but never when he was this close to losing everything. The old tractor had given up 2 weeks earlier, its engine refusing to turn, no matter how long he stood there, with grease on his hands and hope running thin. Repairs cost more than he could manage. Hiring help wasn't an option. What remained was what he had: 2 horses, 1 aging mare, and one that wasn't supposed to be here at all. The work began earlier each morning now, before the heat settled in, before the wind picked up and carried the dust into every corner of the farm. Cal adjusted the harness slowly, checking each strap against Elias's frame. He had made changes, small ones at first, softer padding where the pressure built, a lighter rig borrowed from an old setup that hadn't been used in years. Nothing about it was perfect, but it held. May stood nearby, patient as ever, her presence a quiet constant. When Cal led them out together, Elias fell into step beside her, not matching her stride, but following its rhythm. That was enough. "Easy," Cal murmured as they reached the edge of the field. He didn't ask for much, just a straight line, just a steady pull. The load was light, bundled hay scraps and broken boards, but even that carried weight across uneven ground. Elias leaned into the harness, his body adjusting in ways Cal hadn't expected. The bad leg still lagged slightly behind, but it no longer faltered. Not the way it used to. They moved slowly, deliberately. And they finished what they started. There were no breakthroughs, no sudden moment where everything changed. Only repetition, morning after morning. The same path along the fence line, the same careful turns, the same pause at the far corner where the land dipped slightly before rising again. Cal watched everything. The angle of the horse's shoulders, the way the muscles tightened, then released, the moments when Elias chose to keep moving without being asked. Those moments mattered more than anything else. By the 3rd week, the work expanded. A little farther, a little longer, still controlled, still measured. Cal didn't push beyond what the horse could give. He had learned that much. Forcing it would break something, not just in the leg, but in whatever fragile balance had begun to form. Instead, he let the work shape itself. And Elias responded, not with speed, not with strength, but with something steadier, reliability. One afternoon, as the sun hung low and heavy in the sky, Cal stopped near the edge of the property. The air was still, thick with heat, the kind that made every movement feel heavier than it should. Elias stood beside him, breathing slow, sides rising and falling in a controlled rhythm. May shifted a few steps away, lowering her head toward the sparse grass. Cal loosened the reins and let his hand rest against the horse's neck. "You don't rush," he said quietly. "Don't spook. Don't quit." Elias flicked an ear, the only sign he had heard. Cal looked out across the field, his eyes narrowing slightly. The land beyond his fence stretched farther than his own, open, uneven, marked by years of use. In the distance, faint but visible, a group of men worked a plot with a team of strong, well-trained horses. The lines they cut were clean, efficient, professional. Cal watched for a long moment, then glanced back at Elias. There was no comparison, not in strength, not in form. But something about the way Elias stood there, steady despite the flaw that should have made him useless, refused to settle into the category everyone else had placed him in. Cal exhaled slowly. "Not built like them," he muttered. The wind shifted, brushing lightly across the field, carrying the scent of dry earth and distant movement. But that doesn't mean nothing. That evening, a flyer arrived, folded once, edges worn. It had been left near the mailbox, caught under a small rock to keep it from blowing away. Cal picked it up absent-mindedly, brushing the dust from its surface. His eyes scanned the print without much interest at first. County Heritage Field Day, working horse demonstration, precision handling, load control, obstacle navigation. He almost set it aside. Almost. But something in the wording caught his attention, not the competition itself, but what it required. Not speed, not appearance. Control, consistency, trust under pressure. Cal read it again, slower this time. Behind him, Elias moved across the yard, his steps uneven, but continuous. No hesitation, no wasted motion. Just that same steady rhythm he had carried through every day of work. Cal folded the paper carefully, tucking it into his jacket. He didn't say anything, didn't call out, but his gaze lingered a little longer than before. The next morning the work continued as it always had, same pace, same path, same quiet understanding between man and horse. But now there was something else beneath it. Not hope, not yet, just a question. And sometimes that was enough to change the direction of everything. By the time they reached the county grounds, the sun had already burned the morning haze off the fields. Dust hung low over the arena, stirred by the steady movement of hooves and boots. Trucks lined the outer fence, polished trailers hitched behind them, their sides reflecting the sharp Wyoming light. Men and women moved with purpose, checking tack, tightening straps, speaking in short, practiced tones. Cal parked farther back than most. He didn't rush. He didn't announce himself. He simply opened the trailer gate and stepped aside. Elias stood inside for a moment, still as always, adjusting to the new sounds, the hum of voices, the creak of leather, the hollow thud of hooves against packed ground. Then, carefully, he stepped down, one hoof, then the next. The limp was there, plain as it had ever been. A man walking past slowed just enough to notice. "You bringing him to watch?" he asked, not unkindly. Cal shook his head once. "Entered." The man didn't laugh, but he didn't hide the surprise either. His eyes moved over the horse quickly, measuring what could be seen in a glance. Then he nodded, polite enough to say nothing more, and continued on. Cal led Elias toward the edge of the arena. May wasn't with them this time. There would be no quiet anchor, no steady presence to lean into, just the open field and whatever the day would ask of them. He adjusted the harness slowly, hands moving with familiar precision. The leather was worn but clean, each strap placed exactly where it needed to be. Elias stood through it all, ears flicking once, then settling forward. "You've done this before," Cal murmured, more to steady himself than the horse. The first team entered the field. Two strong draft horses, tall and broad, their coats brushed to a shine. They moved in perfect sync, pulling a weighted sled across the arena with clean, confident strides. The crowd watched closely, murmurs of approval rising and falling with each pass. The second team followed, then the third, each one polished, each one practiced. Cal watched in silence, his jaw tightening slightly. Beside him, Elias shifted once, placing his weight carefully, then settling again. His breathing remained even. His attention moved, not toward the crowd, not toward the noise, but across the field itself, tracking the movement of the teams, the pattern of the work, the same way he had watched from behind the fence. Their turn came without ceremony. A man at the gate lifted a hand, signaling them forward. Cal nodded once and stepped into the arena. The ground felt different here, firmer, packed tight from repeated use. Elias hesitated at the threshold, just for a moment, his body leaning forward without committing. Cal didn't pull, didn't urge. He simply stepped ahead, giving the rope enough slack to make the choice clear. After a breath, Elias followed. The first task was simple, a straight pull across the field, guiding a weighted drag through a marked path, no speed required, just control. Cal set the pace immediately, slow, steady, familiar. Elias leaned into the harness. The first step carried that same uneven rhythm. The second followed. By the third, the movement settled. Not smooth, not balanced, but consistent. The drag moved behind them, cutting a shallow line into the dirt. They didn't rush, didn't falter. At the far end, Cal guided a careful turn. The angle was tight, the ground slightly uneven. Elias adjusted instinctively, shifting weight where he could, compensating without breaking stride. A few voices in the crowd quieted, not in reaction, but in attention. The second task came quickly. Obstacle navigation. Wooden posts set at uneven distances, requiring precise control, careful movement, and patience. This was where most teams showed their training, or their lack of it. Cal shortened his hold slightly. "Easy," he said under his breath. Elias stepped forward, one post, then another, each movement deliberate, no wasted motion, no sudden corrections. The limp remained visible, but it didn't disrupt the line. If anything, it slowed the pace just enough to avoid error. A pole brushed lightly against the harness. Elias paused, adjusted, continued. No panic, no resistance, just that same quiet steadiness. By the time they cleared the final post, the arena had fallen into a different kind of silence. Not empty, but focused. The last task was the heaviest, a weighted sled thicker than the first, set near the center of the field. The judges watched closely now, their expressions unreadable, their attention fixed on the smallest details. Cal walked Elias into position. He could feel the weight of it, not just the sled, but everything that had led to this moment. The dry land, the failing farm, the quiet mornings, the long, patient work that no one else had seen. He rested a hand briefly against the horse's neck. "You don't have to prove anything," he said. Elias stood still, then leaned forward. The harness tightened. The sled resisted for a fraction of a second, then shifted. One step, then another. Slow, measured, unbreakable in its rhythm. The crowd didn't react right away. There was no sudden cheer, no sharp intake of breath, just a gradual shift, a recognition building, piece by piece, as the horse continued forward without hesitation. Not fast, never fast, but steady in a way that held. When they reached the end of the line, Cal brought them to a stop with the lightest pressure. Elias exhaled and stood. For a moment, nothing moved. Then the sound came, not loud, not overwhelming, but enough to carry across the field. A few hands coming together, then more, not for speed, not for strength, but for something harder to name. Cal didn't look toward the crowd. He kept his hand on the rope, his gaze steady, his breath still catching up with him. Beside him, Elias shifted his weight once, then settled again. Unchanged, and somehow entirely different. At the edge of the arena, one of the judges stepped forward, speaking quietly to another. Cal didn't hear the words. He didn't need to. He already understood what mattered. Not the score, not the placement, but the fact that the horse who had been marked as finished had carried something all the way through, without breaking, without stopping. As they stepped out of the arena, the noise returned. the movement, the voices, the life of the place continuing as it always did. But something had shifted, not just in how others saw the horse, but in how the world made space for him. Cal loosened his grip slightly, letting the rope fall into a natural line between them. "You held," he said quietly. Elias flicked an ear, the only answer he ever gave. Ahead, beyond the crowd and the dust, the open land waited. And for the first time, it didn't feel out of reach. The arena slowly emptied, but the dust stayed behind, settling in thin layers over the ground where hooves had pressed their weight into the earth. Voices faded into smaller conversations scattered across the edges of the field. Trucks started, doors closed, and one by one the polished teams were led away. Cal remained where he was. Not in the center, not near the judges, just off to the side, where the fence cast a long, uneven shadow across the dirt. Elias stood beside him, the harness still in place, his breathing steady, his posture unchanged from the moment they had stepped out. There was no urgency in either of them, no need to move first. A man approached from the far end of the field, one of the judges, his hat pulled low against the afternoon light. He carried a clipboard, though it was now tucked under his arm, forgotten. "You planning on heading out?" he asked, stopping a few feet away. Cal glanced up briefly, then back at the horse. "Soon." The man nodded, his eyes moving over Elias with a different kind of attention than before, not quick, not dismissive. He took his time now, noting the stance, the uneven leg, the way the horse held himself without tension. "He's not built like the others," the man said. Cal gave a quiet nod. "No?" Another pause. Then the judge exhaled lightly, as if choosing his words with care. "That last pull," he said, "most horses try to push through it. They fight the weight. Yours didn't." Cal said nothing. "He just stayed with it," the man continued. "Didn't rush, didn't break form. That kind of control, you don't see it often." Cal's hand rested against the rope, his fingers tightening slightly, not in pride, but in recognition. "He's had practice," he replied. The man gave a small, thoughtful smile. "So have most of the ones here." For a moment, neither spoke. Then the judge reached into his jacket and pulled out a small envelope, worn at the edges, sealed, but unmarked. He held it out, not with ceremony, but with a kind of quiet respect. "We added a category this year," he said. "Wasn't planned at the start." Cal looked at the envelope, then at the man. "Working consistency," the judge said, "for the team that showed the most control under load." Cal hesitated, not out of doubt, but because the words didn't seem to fit easily into place. The man didn't press. He simply extended his arm a little further. Cal took the envelope. It was lighter than he expected. "Doesn't change the leg," Cal said after a moment. The judge shook his head. "No." "Doesn't make him faster?" "No." Another pause. "But it means something," the man added quietly. Cal looked down at the horse. Elias hadn't moved. His ears shifted once, catching the sound of a trailer door closing somewhere behind them, then settled again. The same calm presence, the same steady breath. Nothing about him had changed. And yet, everything had. Cal slipped the envelope into his jacket pocket, his hand lingering there for just a second longer than necessary. "Thank you," he said. The judge gave a small nod, then turned and walked back toward the remaining officials, leaving them alone once more. The sun had begun its slow descent by the time Cal led Elias back toward the trailer. The light stretched long across the ground, softening the edges of everything it touched. Dust rose beneath each step, catching the glow and holding it there for a moment before drifting away. Elias climbed the ramp without hesitation. One step, then another. The same uneven rhythm, the same quiet determination. Cal closed the gate behind him, securing the latch with practiced hands. For a moment he stood there, resting his palm against the metal, listening to the faint shift of movement inside. Then he turned. The field was nearly empty now. Only a few figures remained in the distance, their voices too far to carry. The banners had stilled. The wind had softened. It was over. But it didn't feel like an ending. The drive back took longer. Not because the road had changed, but because something else had. Cal didn't rush, didn't push the truck beyond what it needed to do. The land rolled out beside him, familiar and worn, the same dry stretches, the same open sky. But now it felt different in a way he couldn't quite name. When the farm came back into view, the light had already dipped low, turning the horizon into a quiet line of gold and shadow. May lifted her head as the truck pulled in. She didn't move toward the fence. She simply watched. Cal opened the trailer and stepped aside. Elias descended the ramp with the same careful motion, his hooves finding the ground without hesitation. He paused once, just long enough to take in the space, then stepped forward into the pasture. May turned slightly, acknowledging him, then lowered her head again. Nothing dramatic, nothing forced, just a continuation. Cal removed the harness slowly, setting each piece aside with care. When he finished, he rested his hand briefly against Elias's neck. "You did your part," he said. The horse stood still, his breathing even, his gaze drifting once more across the open land beyond the fence. Not searching, not waiting, just present. Cal stepped back, giving him space. There was still work ahead, repairs to make, fields to tend, a season that wouldn't wait for anything or anyone. But now there was something else too. Not a solution, not a guarantee, just a possibility that hadn't existed before. As the last light faded, Elias moved slowly across the pasture, his steps leaving faint impressions in the dry earth. Uneven, but steady. And behind him, those marks stretched forward, not in perfect lines, not without flaw, but continuing all the same, out toward whatever came next.
If this story meant something to you, share your thoughts below and follow Horse Heart Healing for more stories like this.